The encrypted message flashed onto the tablet screen, a series of cold, unfeeling commands. No sender, no signature, just a task. Haven 34. Full erasure. Report success. No questions. It wasn't the first time I'd been sent on a mission like this. Precision erasure was my job, wiping out what the world didn't need to remember. But Haven 34? That name felt heavier, familiar in a way that left my stomach knotted. I scrolled through the attached documents. Most of it was blacked out. What little I could read spoke of evacuation orders decades ago. A containment failure was mentioned, but what was being contained? Entire paragraphs were lost under thick black lines. All I had was a location, a set of digital tools to execute the erasure, and a creeping sense of dread. What stuck with me most was the note at the bottom. Teams Alpha and Beta. No response. That wasn't normal. Teams didn't just vanish. I didn't ask questions because questions didn't matter. Not when the people giving orders never answered them. Packing was automatic. Field kit, high-frequency disruptors, electromagnetic scramblers. Standard tools for wiping out data, tech, and any remnants of civilization. The agency didn't send people into places like Haven 34 for cleanup. They sent them to erase it like it had never existed. The journey began under a leaden sky. The roads were empty, eerily so. The occasional skeletal remains of gas stations and rest stops dotted the route, but there was no movement, no life. My vehicle's radio crackled with static, occasionally punctuated by faint, incomprehensible whispers. It was probably interference, I told myself, or maybe just the vehicle's systems glitching. But each burst of static felt deliberate, as if it were trying to form words. The farther I drove, the stranger the landscape became. Trees twisted unnaturally, their branches curling toward the ground like they were recoiling from something unseen. The air seemed thicker, almost oppressive, as if the land itself wanted me gone. Then came the malfunctions. My GPS blinked out first, then the comms gear. Both systems rebooted, but now the coordinates for Haven 34 pulsed faintly on the map screen, as if being drawn by an invisible signal. I tried to reset it, but the vehicle wouldn't allow manual inputs anymore. My hands tightened on the wheel. The silence pressed against me like a living thing, and the whispers on the radio grew louder. As I neared Haven 34, the road abruptly ended, giving way to cracked pavement and overgrown weeds. The city loomed in the distance, shrouded in a dense, unnatural fog that swallowed the horizon. The sheer stillness of it was wrong. No wind, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive quiet. From a distance, the buildings looked pristine, their clean facades preserved as if untouched by time. But the closer I got, the more I noticed things that didn't make sense. Streetlights stood intact, yet their bulbs flickered faintly, casting shadows that seemed too long, too sharp. Cars sat parked along the curbs, their exteriors rust-free, but windows clouded over like frosted glass. Symbols began to appear, scrawled on walls, carved into the sidewalks, even painted on street signs. They were jagged, chaotic marks that seemed to vibrate with an unsettling energy. The graffiti, though faded, was more direct. Warnings to turn back, stay away, and they are watching. I stepped out of the vehicle, my boots crunching against the brittle asphalt. The air was colder than it should have been, carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. My gear beeped faintly, picking up fluctuations I couldn't yet explain. Standing at the edge of the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. There was no movement, no sound beyond my own footsteps, but the weight of unseen eyes pressed heavily against my shoulders. Each step deeper into Haven 34 felt like an intrusion, a trespass into a place that wanted to be forgotten. The whispers were louder now, not from the radio but from somewhere around me, too faint to make out but too persistent to ignore. My equipment began to pick up faint noises, irregular beeps, soft static bursts, like the remnants of a signal that didn't belong here. I glanced at my tablet. trying to recalibrate the tools for the erasure protocol, but the interface stuttered and flickered. The coordinates had changed again, drawing me toward the city's heart. With each step, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to shift, as if alive. At the city's edge, I hesitated. My instincts screamed to stop, to turn around, to run. But the mission demanded progress, and questions didn't matter. Whatever was waiting for me inside Haven, 34 had already noticed my arrival. The streets stretched out in eerie silence, unnaturally clean, as though someone or something was maintaining them. Not a speck of dust, no signs of weathering or decay. Cars were neatly parked, doors shut, yet their interiors were empty. A rusted playground sat at the edge of a park, the swings perfectly still despite the faintest breeze brushing the trees. My eyes lingered on the clock tower in the town square. Its hands moved, but not forward. They ticked backward, the faint sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. I crouched to pick up a newspaper left on a bench. The headline caught my eye. Life in Haven 34, a new era. The date was bold and clear, but something about it felt wrong. I checked the next page, same date, same stories, repeated again and again. I flipped through the entire paper. Every page was the same. The air around me seemed to thicken as I stared at it. Abandoned shops stood with their displays intact. Mannequins frozen mid-pose, some eerily bent as though melted. A faint ringing noise came from one of the stores. I stepped inside, careful, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The source of the noise was an old telephone mounted on the wall. It wasn't connected to anything. Further into the city, I came across a small house. Its door was slightly ajar, revealing an interior untouched by time. Personal belongings lay scattered, as if whoever lived here had vanished mid-moment. Journals were stacked neatly on a desk. I flipped through the pages, scanning the handwritten notes. One entry read, "They come at night, always watching. Their whispers seep into dreams. We can't leave. We can't leave." The handwriting grew erratic as the pages progressed, the words trailing off into jagged spirals. I left the house, but carried the growing weight of unease with me. Everywhere I went, there were signs of life abruptly interrupted. A dinner table set for a meal, toys abandoned mid-play, faint footprints frozen in the dust. The city wasn't just empty. It felt paused, as though the people here had been erased in an instant, leaving only these strange echoes of their existence. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft, faint, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere nearby, its tone strange and layered, like multiple voices speaking as one. I froze, listening. The sound came again, drifting through the empty streets, yet I couldn't pinpoint its origin. I found myself drawn to a building that appeared to be a municipal office. Inside, the walls seemed alive with faint traces of movement. The whispers grew louder, emanating from somewhere deep within. My flashlight caught the faintest flicker of something shifting in the corner of my eye. When I turned, nothing was there. I climbed the stairs cautiously, every step creaking underfoot. Shadows danced unnaturally, pooling where light should not have touched. My breathing grew shallow as I caught another glimpse of movement, this time closer, more defined. It wasn't just shadows. It was a figure, humanoid but wrong, elongated, angular, and featureless. I blinked, and it was gone. My flashlight illuminated nothing but the peeling paint of the walls. The whisper stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, unnerving silence. The tension in the air was suffocating. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my feet carried me forward. The library was the next building I entered, its towering shelves lined with books untouched by time. The smell of old paper filled the air, a sharp contrast to the metallic tang that clung to the city outside. The floor creaked underfoot, but something felt off. Each step echoed too loudly, as if the space around me wasn't entirely real. On a desk near the center of the room, a single book lay open, its pages filled with scrawled handwriting. The ink was smudged, but the message was clear. Do not stay after nightfall. They come to reclaim. My pulse quickened as I checked my watch. The faint glow of its display revealed the time, barely an hour until dusk. I glanced out a nearby window. The shadows outside had grown longer, stretching unnaturally as the light began to fade. The warning burned in my mind. Whatever inhabited this place, whatever they weren't far off. I needed to move. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the transformation began. The fading light cast a strange, unnatural glow over the city, and the air itself seemed to hum with tension. Shadows pooled and stretched across the streets, their edges sharp and menacing, moving as if alive. The fog thickened, not gently but in sudden, suffocating waves, enveloping entire blocks in opaque silence. The whispers returned, louder now, layered with distortion that made them sound less human and more like a chorus of broken machinery. They came from every direction, overlapping and cascading until they formed a low, throbbing drone that reverberated in my chest. My every breath felt heavier, like I was inhaling the weight of the city itself. I turned toward the edge of Haven 34, determined to leave before night consumed the streets entirely. But no matter which route I took, the road circled back to the same place. My footsteps echoed eerily in the empty streets, sometimes mismatched with my movements, like they belonged to someone else. I tried to mark my path, scratching walls, leaving objects, but the landmarks would disappear or shift entirely when I passed them again. The looping became more sinister as time stretched unnaturally. What should have been moments felt like hours. The fog glowed faintly in patches, casting fleeting shapes that evaporated the moment I tried to focus on them. Panic clawed at my throat as I realized the city wasn't letting me leave. The streets had become a labyrinth, a trap that shifted and rearranged itself the moment my back was turned. The whispers grew into an unsettling crescendo. They didn't sound like voices anymore. They were something deeper, a guttural, vibrating resonance that seemed to dig into my skull. That's when I saw them. In the distance, near the edge of the fog, figures began to emerge. Their forms were distorted at first, barely distinguishable from the mist, but as they stepped closer, their grotesque shapes became clear. They were humanoid in the loosest sense, tall, impossibly thin, their limbs stretched and bent at wrong angles. Their faces were featureless, smooth and blank like porcelain masks, yet their heads tilted in ways that suggested they were watching me. Their movements were jarring, a mix of unnervingly slow jerks and sudden, unnatural bursts of speed. They didn't walk so much as shift, flickering from one position to another in a way that made my eyes ache to follow. Each step they took seemed to distort the space around them, bending the air like a mirage. The flashlight in my hand flickered violently, its beam cutting through the fog in disjointed bursts. For brief moments, the city seemed to change entirely under its light. The pristine streets transformed into a blood-soaked nightmare. Buildings were crumbling, windows shattered, and the walls dripped with a viscous black substance. When the light faltered again, the city snapped back to its original state. My pulse thundered in my ears as the figures closed in. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt leaden, trapped in the same unnatural rhythm as the city's warped reality. Time itself seemed fractured, moments stretching and snapping unpredictably. I tried to back away, but each step took me closer to another figure, as if the space around me had folded in on itself. One of the entities tilted its head sharply, as though acknowledging my presence. The whispers sharpened into something coherent, a single word spoken in an alien, reverberating tone. Stay. The word froze me in place. My surroundings warped again, and I stumbled into an alley that hadn't been there before. The walls pressed in, the air thick with the stench of decay. At the end of the alley, I found a rusted metal door slightly ajar, light seeping from its edges. Inside was a chamber unlike anything else in the city. It was circular, the walls lined with monitors and consoles covered in dust. Strange, indecipherable symbols pulsed faintly on the screens, their glow casting warped shadows across the room. In the center stood a cylindrical object, humming faintly. Around it lay scattered documents, their edges singed as though they'd narrowly escaped destruction. I picked up the nearest file. The words leapt out at me, their meaning both horrifying and strangely inevitable. Dimensional rift experiment. Subject Alpha, Haven 34. Containment failed. The accompanying note spoke of an attempt to harness energy from another dimension. What they had tapped into wasn't just energy. It was alive. The project had gone catastrophically wrong, tearing a hole between our world and the other. Haven 34 hadn't been abandoned. It had been erased, consumed by whatever had come through. The whispers returned louder, closer. I turned to see the entities standing at the edge of the chamber, their blank faces tilting in unison. The word came again, spoken by 1,000 voices layered together. Stay. The instant I stepped out of the chamber, they were waiting. The watchers had multiplied, their blank faces and jagged movements now surrounding me on every side. They didn't walk. They glided, their limbs extending and contorting as though testing the limits of physical form. The whispers returned, louder, distorted, a cacophony that drilled into my mind. My flashlight flickered weakly in my hand, the beam carving fragile paths of safety in the thickening darkness. I ran. The city warped around me, its streets stretching and twisting in ways that defied logic. Every alley seemed endless. Every corner brought me face to face with more of them. They appeared and vanished in the blink of an eye, moving faster than thought, sometimes seeming to split into multiple forms, each more grotesque than the last. My gear began to fail. My communicator crackled. My watch reset itself to 0, and the flashlight's beam grew dimmer with every step. Desperation forced me to improvise. I grabbed a flare from my pack, its harsh red light cutting through the oppressive fog. The watchers recoiled, their distorted forms retreating briefly into the shadows. But it wasn't enough. The flare sputtered and died too quickly, leaving me vulnerable again. Their presence pressed closer, suffocating and relentless. I realized the only chance I had was to find the source, the center of all this madness. The whispers weren't just noise. They were leading me somewhere. The distorted cadence forming patterns that pulled me forward despite every instinct screaming to flee. I pushed through the crumbling streets, navigating by flickering lights and half-formed shapes that danced in the fog. My path was littered with strange markings and symbols etched into the ground, glowing faintly. They formed a trail, each step dragging me closer to the epicenter of Haven 34's horror. Then I saw it. Rising from the heart of the city was the anomaly, a massive, pulsating sphere of shifting light and shadow, suspended above a jagged pit. It was alive, its surface rippling as though breathing, exuding waves of nausea and dread that made my knees buckle. The watchers were gathered around it, kneeling in a trance-like state, their blank faces tilted upward, as though worshipping the thing that had stolen the city from reality. The low-frequency hum emanating from the anomaly was suffocating, vibrating through my chest and making the world around me blur. I crept closer, each step feeling like wading through invisible resistance. My gear was utterly useless now, the electronic displays flickering before powering off entirely. Yet I couldn't stop. Whatever the anomaly was, it wasn't just a portal. It was the heart of everything wrong with Haven 34. A flickering monitor near the edge of the pit caught my eye. Its screen displayed a corrupted video feed, the audio crackling with bursts of static. A voice, garbled but insistent, emerged from the noise. Haven 34, Test Site Alpha, Dimensional Rift Project, Containment Breach, Irreversible. The portal was not just energy. It was sentient. We brought it here. It won't let us go. The recording dissolved into static, but the weight of its words crushed any remaining hope. This wasn't just an accident or a failed experiment. Haven 34 had been a deliberate gamble, and whatever lived on the other side of the portal had taken that gamble and twisted it into something monstrous. The watchers stirred, The anomaly pulsed violently, its surface erupting in chaotic bursts of light. They turned toward me in unison, their movements more erratic, more aggressive. The whispers surged, transforming into an incomprehensible roar that filled my mind. There was no more time to think, only to act. I scrambled for the scattered machinery near the anomaly, my hands trembling as I pieced together an improvised device. The fragments were rusted and alien in design, clearly from the experiment that doomed Haven 34. The pulsing waves of energy from the portal made it almost impossible to focus, each surge dragging me closer to nausea and unconsciousness. But there was no other choice. The Watchers sensed my intent. They moved faster, no longer retreating from the weak light of my flashlight or the flares. Their jagged limbs stretched toward me, their blank faces tilting unnaturally as they closed the distance. I lashed out with a wrench, the impact connecting with a sickening crack that felt more like striking dense rubber than flesh. It staggered one Watcher, but two more appeared, their forms flickering in and out of the fog. The device sparked to life in my hands, emitting a low hum that resonated with the anomaly's vibrations. It wasn't stable, but it didn't need to be. I only needed it to work long enough to overload the portal. The Watchers surged forward as I placed the device near the base of the anomaly, their movements frantic now, as if realizing their lifeline was under threat. They attacked with ferocity, their distorted limbs tearing at my clothes, my gear, and my skin. Pain shot through my body as one managed to rake its elongated fingers across my arm. I swung wildly, using the flashlight as a club, its beam flickering as I fought to keep them at bay. Every second felt like an eternity, the whispers in my head now a deafening roar that threatened to shatter my grip on reality. Finally, the device reached its peak. The hum grew into an ear-splitting whine, the machinery trembling violently as it synchronized with the portal's frequency. The Watchers froze momentarily, their featureless faces tilting as though in recognition of the inevitable. Then the device erupted in a blinding surge of energy. The anomaly convulsed, its surface rippling violently before collapsing inward. The Watchers disintegrated one by one, their forms crumbling into ash-like remnants that dissolved into the air. The whispers cut off abruptly, leaving a suffocating silence in their place. For a brief moment, I thought it was over, but as the portal imploded, I caught a glimpse of the other side. It wasn't just darkness. It was a living void, a shifting expanse of horrors that defied comprehension. Shapes moved within it, massive and formless, their movements slow yet impossibly vast. Eyes, countless otherworldly eyes, seemed to turn toward me, their gaze piercing even through the brief flicker of the collapsing portal. The city began to collapse, the ground shaking as buildings crumbled into themselves. I ran, stumbling through the shifting streets, debris crashing around me. The air felt heavier with every step, the remnants of the Watchers ash swirling in chaotic eddies. The path out of the city shifted in impossible ways, but somehow I broke through the fog and into the dead forest beyond. I didn't stop running until Haven 34 was a faint glow on the horizon, the city's final death throes lighting up the night sky. My lungs burned, and every inch of me ached, but I was alive. Barely. When I finally reported back, my superiors' reactions were cold and rehearsed. They didn't ask about the Watchers or the portal, only whether the objective had been completed. It didn't take long for me to piece it together. They had known. They'd set me in not to save anyone, but to ensure the city and its secret were destroyed, no matter the cost. The finality of their indifference settled heavily on me, but something else gnawed at my mind. As I left the debriefing, I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible. A whisper. My head snapped around, but the corridor was empty, yet the sound persisted, just at the edge of hearing, growing louder when I stepped into the shadows. In the days that followed, the shadows began to feel alive, and reflections lingered too long in mirrors. At night, I dreamed of blank faces and shifting voids, the whispers from Haven 34 now a constant background noise. I knew then that Haven 34 hadn't let me leave. Not entirely. The Watchers weren't gone. They never would be.